May 3, 1996 began like most spring evenings in Fairbanks, Alaska, where daylight lingers too long and the air still carries the bite of winter even when the snow starts to thin. Jessica Baggen was 17 and moving through that age where time feels split between what you're told to do and what you quietly decide for yourself. She left for a party that evening, nothing unusual in the way she said it or the way the day had unfolded before it. A short trip. A familiar group. A night that was supposed to end with a ride back home or a walk through streets she already knew by memory. No one marked it as important when she stepped out the door. Not because she was unimportant, but because nothing about the moment suggested it would need remembering. By the next morning, she did not come back. At first, it did not register as anything more than delay. In a place like Fairbanks, plans bend easily. Weather, distance, timing, all of it can stretch an evening without warning. But as hours passed and then a full day settled in without contact, the shape of the absence changed. It stopped being about lateness and started becoming something heavier, something that refused to resolve itself. The last confirmed sighting placed her leaving the gathering and moving into the sequence of streets that should have led her toward a known route. After that, the record becomes fragmented. Conversations that don't fully align. Timelines that drift apart when repeated. Details that feel close enough to hold but not solid enough to rely on. At this stage, nothing had yet become official. But something had already shifted. The space she occupied in ordinary memory had been vacated without explanation, and that kind of absence begins to change how people speak. The first response is always reconstruction. People start rebuilding the night from pieces they did not think were important when they first saw them. Who was there? Who left when? Who spoke to whom? Every detail becomes slightly heavier in hindsight, as if meaning could be recovered through repetition. What makes this stage unstable is not what is known, but what is almost known. A direction someone might have taken. A moment someone might have noticed something different. A detail that sits just outside confirmation. And in that space, uncertainty begins to accumulate. There is a pattern that appears in cases where someone young disappears after a social gathering. The environment is familiar enough to lower caution, but fluid enough that accountability disperses quickly. Responsibility spreads across multiple people, and in that spread, clarity becomes harder to establish. No single moment explains the shift. It is a sequence of ordinary actions that, when placed together later, refuse to form a clean line. Within days, attention turns outward. The route she would have taken becomes a map of repeated questions. Areas are checked and rechecked. People retrace movements with increasing urgency, as if repetition could tighten what time has already loosened. But the absence does not respond to effort. It expands. The first days carry a kind of restrained tension, where hope and concern still share the same space. But as time passes, the balance begins to tilt. Each unanswered question removes a small piece of the assumption that this will resolve quickly. At a certain point, the investigation shifts from waiting to searching. And searching changes the tone entirely. What was once a missing person becomes a pattern that needs explanation. 10 days later, the pattern breaks in a way that no longer allows for ambiguity. Her body is found in a remote area outside the usual paths of travel. The distance alone changes the interpretation of everything that came before it. This was not a continuation of the night anymore. It was the end of it, separated from the origin by terrain, time, and deliberate movement. The condition of the scene introduces a second layer of reality that overrides speculation. The physical evidence speaks in a way that does not depend on interpretation. It establishes force, restraint, and finality without needing to explain intention. From this point forward, the case no longer moves through uncertainty alone. It moves through reconstruction. What happened is no longer the question. The question becomes how the sequence was constructed. Investigators begin by narrowing the timeline. The last confirmed contact becomes the anchor point. Everything after it is treated as a narrowing corridor where possibilities are eliminated one by one. Movement patterns are reconstructed in reverse. The space between the last known location and the discovery site is studied not as distance, but as decision-making. Every segment of time becomes a potential window where interaction could have occurred. At this stage, evidence begins to separate into categories. Some information is stable. Some is inconsistent. Some refuses to align with anything else. That imbalance is where investigative focus sharpens. When DNA evidence enters the picture, the case transitions into a different phase entirely. Biological material removes ambiguity about contact. It confirms that physical proximity occurred in a way that cannot be explained through coincidence or environmental transfer alone. But even with that confirmation, identity does not automatically follow. Evidence can describe presence. It cannot always describe sequence. And sequence is what matters most when reconstructing what cannot be witnessed. The investigation begins to tighten around a smaller set of possibilities. Attention narrows toward individuals whose proximity to the timeline places them within the critical window. Statements are revisited. Movements are compared. Small inconsistencies become more significant under repeated review. What emerges is not a single clear path, but a structure of overlapping accounts that resist full alignment. That resistance becomes part of the case itself. As weeks turn into months, the investigation enters a slower phase where urgency is replaced by persistence. Evidence does not disappear, but it stops producing immediate resolution. Each new review returns to the same core tension: physical proof of what occurred, and uncertainty about how it unfolded in sequence. This gap between what is known and what is proven becomes the central weight of the case. Communities that were once focused on search begin to shift into reflection. Conversations change tone. Questions become less about location and more about cause. The absence of closure starts to shape how the event is remembered. In cases like this, time does not reduce complexity. It reorganizes it. Over time, the investigation reaches a point where all primary elements are identified but not fully connected into a single uncontested narrative. There is evidence of violence. There is evidence of contact. There is a confirmed location where the final outcome occurred. What remains unresolved is the exact chain that connects each point without contradiction. That missing chain is where speculation often tries to enter, but the official record holds only what can be supported. Everything else remains outside confirmed structure. For those closest to the case, the absence becomes permanent. Not because nothing is known, but because what is known does not fully resolve into a complete explanation that satisfies every layer of evidence at once. This is the point where a case stops being active and starts becoming fixed. Not solved in feeling, but stabilized in record. Years later, when the file is revisited, it does not reopen as a mystery in motion. It reopens as a structured set of facts that still resist full narrative closure. The physical evidence remains unchanged. The timeline remains partially reconstructed. The unanswered segment remains exactly where it was left. What changes over time is not the case itself, but the weight carried by those who encountered it when it was still unfolding. The absence becomes part of a larger pattern seen in other investigations where contact, movement, and outcome can be mapped, but intention remains partially inaccessible. There is a final layer that often goes unspoken in cases like this. It is the distance between knowing what happened and understanding how easily ordinary sequences can become irreversible when conditions align in the wrong way. A gathering that ends normally. A departure that looks routine. A route that should have been short. And then a break in continuity that cannot be restored by returning to earlier points. Once that break occurs, everything that follows belongs to reconstruction, not prevention. The final record does not attempt to fill the gap with assumption. It leaves it as a defined absence within a completed structure. That absence is what gives the case its lasting weight. Not because it is unsolved, but because it is partially known in a way that cannot be made whole.